Hello and welcome to PTV World, the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you today. We're going to be talking about two very important stories. The first is with reference to what is going on with regards to the Iranian nuclear deal, something that of course has been going on for a very long time, but there is a different angle to it now. Our first segment looks at that. Russia, as we all know, is undergoing the crisis at Ukraine. It has put forward another demand with reference to what is going on in Ukraine in terms of US sanctions, which it says is likely going to impact the Iranian nuclear deal, and it needs a guarantee from the US that if it will not impact the nuclear deal, then only it will go ahead with the Iranian nuclear deal, something that Antony Blinken has spoken about and said has nothing to do with each other and is totally different. We're going to explore further what exactly are the different aspects of this particular deal and the issues, and of course the fact whether or not this is going to have a huge impact on the way it's going to move forward, because we of course know there are other challenges to the nuclear deal itself. In our second segment of the show, we'll also be taking a look at the overall global economy, what is going on in the world. The first impact that we already know since COVID has been in terms of price hikes all over the world. But we also know now that after oil and coal, prices of diesel have also increased, and there is a huge shortage of diesel as well. How it's going to impact economies around the world, particularly countries like Pakistan, who are of course developing and are already suffering in terms of the inflation hike globally. We're going to see what the future holds in terms of the economic impact, and then what can actually be done about it. To talk about these two segments and more, we have with us in the studios none other than Raja Faisal, of course, and we've also been joined by Mr. Adil Sultan, who is the HOD at Air University Strategic Studies Department, and he's also a nuclear security expert. Thank you very much, Mr. Adil, for joining us in the studio. We're also going to be joined online by two important guests for our first segment. We're going to be joined by Professor Scott Lucas on Skype, who's a political analyst and a regular on our show. And around 7:15, we'll also be joined by Syed Mustafa, who's a senior foreign policy plus strategic affairs analyst, who's going to be joining us very soon as well. I'll start with you, Mr. Adil. When we talk about what is going on in terms of the nuclear deal, this is something that we have had hopes on for such a long time. And we also understand that this is something that is moving, even though it's moving cripplingly slow, we understand that this is something that the entire world has its eyes on and we want to be able to see. But Russia has put in a different angle to it at this point. And there is, of course, the counter remarks coming in from the US side that perhaps these two are not as linked as Russia seems to be putting it forward. Is this just something you think, in your opinion, with reference to what is going on in Ukraine, and is just a way that Russia is utilizing the situation in the evolving arena? Or is it because it actually has an impact on the Iranian nuclear deal?
Yes, it is very much related to what is happening in Ukraine, and Russia is using this opportunity to bargain its own bit. But I don't know, because the Iranian interests are also ingrained in this. I think Iranians are also finding it an opportune time to negotiate with the United States. So what my analysis is, probably Iran and the rest of the countries might agree to some kind of an arrangement. What Russia is trying to exploit this opportunity for its own or quid pro quo kind of a bargain by saying that trade with Russia and Iran should not be affected, and the United States should give it in written guarantees. I don't think so. US is going to give that kind of guarantees, but Russia is an important country, part of this P5+1 process, and it might continue to object this. But there's also a certain angle to this. Russia also has its bilateral relations with Iran, which it doesn't want to spoil. So it can go to an extent, but I don't think so it is going to veto that. Whatever arrangement is going to come out finally between United States and Iran, which is the principal two interlocutors, and rest of the countries will also support that. But it's interesting, both Iran and Russia, it's an opportunity for Iran to get a favorable outcome, what it has been looking for, because the prices of oil, as you mentioned, are going high, and Iranians could reap dividends if they reach a conclusion. But we have to see how Russia responds, because Russia has limitations. It cannot go beyond a certain point without annoying Iranians.
Right, of course. Scott, I would like to bring you in the conversation here. When we talk about the Iran-Russia relationship, as Mr. Adil was saying, it's an important one and an evolving one as well. And I understand the kind of leverage Iran may be hoping for from Russia. But we've seen in the past as well that the kind of demands that Russia has put in terms of the Ukrainian crisis as well, or assurances from NATO, haven't really been met. And what actually has happened is what we're looking at right now in terms of US sanctions, and then, of course, the movement by Russia as well. Can we really expect this particular demand to be even heard or be given any sort of an importance? Is Russia really playing at this demand to be fulfilled, or is this something else that is the objective?
No, it's really interesting that the Ukraine invasion by Vladimir Putin almost turns a kaleidoscope on other issues. So up until 2 weeks ago, we might be talking about Iran and Russia talking about an economic, a political relationship, Iran looking to Russia to help it out in the Vienna talks on the nuclear program. But Russia, with the invasion of Ukraine, has almost given up its leverage. It's done so in many areas, but specifically it's given up its leverage regarding Iran. Because what it is now saying, not just to the United States, not to the European powers, but to the Iranians is, we'll hold this nuclear deal hostage until we get some assurances that the Western sanctions, in fact, the international sanctions on us, will be eased. Now, the Iranians, quite understandably, don't want that to happen. They don't want the Iran nuclear talks to be held hostage because, as you have pointed out, not only does it get them out of a long-term economic problem because they have been under US sanctions, they have this opportunity with oil possibly hitting record levels this week in terms of its price. And Russia is almost saying to Tehran, we're happy to snatch that away by delaying the completion of the deal or even sabotaging it.
Right, and this is an important aspect because the kind of impact it's going to have on the Iranian nuclear deal is going to be an important decision-making factor for Iran. Faisal, do you think, in your opinion, Iran is going to be able to use this as a support in terms of what it wants out of the Iranian nuclear deal? Or is it going to be, in fact, more damaging or harmful for Iran, as Scott was pointing out, and perhaps an alternative can be looked at without Russia's involvement?
Sana, how I see it, I think it's a very tricky situation for Tehran right now, because if we look at the past, of course, the leverage their economy was having in the past, of course, it was from Kremlin. Kremlin really helped Tehran out throughout. And I think they will be in a very tricky situation right now, because surely this deal, if it is done, of course, it will be bringing a positive effect on their economy and positive effect on the lives of the people of Iran. But you know, it's a very tricky situation, and I would call it a tricky situation.
And it's important to also note here that it's tricky irrespective of the Russian angle as well. It has always been tricky. There are so many other challenging issues that are already in place of the nuclear deal actually achieving its success. Mr. Adil, do you think that even if we rule out what's going on in terms of Russian demands, have we made any progress in terms of achieving a nuclear deal with Iran once again? Because, of course, a few challenging issues still remain.
Yes, there are a few challenges, but I think there has been significant progress between Iran and the IEA and the United States. The United States is not directly negotiating, but whatever IEA or rest of the countries are negotiating, they are negotiating on behalf of the United States. And the signals that are coming from both sides, I think those are positive. Iranians are very hopeful. US side is hopeful, IEA is hopeful, and rest of the European countries are also very hopeful. Probably Russia can't do much, but it is also important that without Russia negotiating a final arrangement is also difficult, because Russia was one country which was supposed to take excess uranium from the Iranians. Now that kind of arrangement, like US Secretary of State also indicated, there are some issues that needs to be negotiated. Now that's where Russians are using that leverage, because nobody can push Russia out of this P5+1 arrangement, because then it has to be negotiated all over again. Russia was one of the principal interlocutors in this P5+1 process, which has been supporting Iranian position also and facilitating these talks also. But like I said, Russia also recognizes that at this moment it cannot lose too many friends, countries which were closer to Russia. So they might come up with some kind of an arrangement, but there's hardly any leverage for the Russians. As the things appear, the deal is likely. When?
Okay.
We don't know. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Adil, I'll explore this more when you said the deal is likely and what sort of issues, if possible, would be able to put a red line or not. I want to explore that further, but we're going to hold that thought, and I also want to talk to Scott with reference to what has just been said. When we see a possibility of the nuclear deal actually moving forward without Russia, considering the kind of demand that Russia has put forward and it's not being met, is that something that Russia will let happen, or can other countries actually move ahead with a scenario where Russia's involvement is not required? And B, how far do you think Russia will be able to push this? Because of course we've seen before as well that the kind of demands that have been put forward have not really been met. And if this is something that Russia is putting on the table, will it be able to backtrack from it?
Those are really great questions. On the first aspect, yes, I mean, this could proceed without the Russians signing on to the final deal. So we would have the irony that it was the United States which withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018, which put it into jeopardy. In 2022,
yes,
the United States rejoins the deal, and now Moscow leaves. Now, will Russia do that? I think that's a huge risk. It's not only a risk, of course, with its relationship with Iran, it's a risk with its relationship with China. Russia's been putting a great deal of the idea of, look, if we face Western economic sanctions, we can work with the Chinese. We have this alternative economic approach. But the Chinese want this Iran nuclear issue resolved as well. They want it resolved for economic and political reasons. They don't want that instability. So I think if the Russians continue to persist with this, they isolate themselves. Now, can they backtrack? See, that's the really difficult question, because what we're seeing now is that the Russians are digging themselves in deeper and deeper on a series of positions. They've done it, of course, over Ukraine, simply by launching the invasion, simply by escalating the invasion with the bombing of residential areas, with the killing of civilians. Now they're digging themselves deeper in terms of the international arena around Ukraine, which is, well, we can defy the West, the international community, over sanctions. And now they're saying we can defy everyone over the Iran nuclear deal, even the Chinese. Vladimir Putin's goal, and we need to be clear about this, is a personal goal to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia. And what the Iran nuclear deal is showing is that he's giving himself no way to back out of that. There's no off-ramp for this diplomatically if he persists with that goal.
Right, and this is an important aspect to understand and realize as well when we talk about what really would be the end goal of Russian moves, because that, of course, is going to decide how far it's going to go. Let me also welcome in our show Mr. Syed Mustafa, who's a senior foreign policy and strategic affairs analyst. Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa, for joining us in the debate. Earlier, as you must have heard, Scott was talking about the fact that the China aspect in terms of the nuclear deal is also an important factor to take into. And we've seen recently that China and Russia have also been warming up, and Iran and Russia is also an important relationship. When we talk about the nuclear deal, and as Scott was saying, is also important to the Chinese side, how far do you think Russia will be able to go ahead with its stance that it's putting forward and save itself from getting impacted in terms of its relations with China?
Hello, thanks for having me. Well, that's a good question. As a matter of fact, what I can tell you is that Iran regulates its foreign relations based on national interests and its independence and sovereignty. So it cares very much for the other parties, all relevant parties to the JCPOA talks in Vienna, to respect its national interests. The same way Iran comprehends and understands and respects Russian and the Chinese concerns but it also expects all relevant parties, including the United States and Russia, both, to respect Iran's concerns as well, and it expects others to avoid boiling their concerns and issues over to the Vienna talks. This is very important to Iran. And Iran expects all relevant parties to take fast and immediate initiatives.
So what are you saying? Sorry to cut you, Mr. Mustafa, but so what you're basically saying is that Iran has its reservations about Russia's comments and wants it to clarify, right?
No. What I say is that Iran is, of course, is waiting for Russia, for Moscow to clarify more its stance, because what we have been hearing from Mr. Olyanov is different. The Russian ambassador to Tehran also told Iranian media a few hours ago that there has been a misunderstanding in understanding the statements and stances of Mr. Lavrov's, the Russian foreign minister. So Iran is, of course, waiting for more clarifications to realize the detailed stance of Russia and China. But at the same time, as a friendly state, Iran truly understands the concerns of the Russians, but it expects all parties, as I said, the United States and Russia both, and the Chinese, to realize that Iran matters for its national interests, and it expects them to avoid boiling their issues over to the Vienna talks, which is in line with Iran's national interest, and it's a very crucial issue. And also, let's remember that the Russian and the Chinese demand is not the only thing that has stalled the talks. There are still a few more points between Tehran and the United States that have remained unresolved. They are standing the United States political decision. As a matter of fact, they are stalling, and they are stalling the talks, irrespective of the Russian and the Chinese demands. The Americans have been stalling the talks. Iran, the stance is very official that Iran wants a fast and immediate solution in agreement, but a good agreement, a strong agreement, of course, not any kind of agreement. That is to say, Iran expects the United States to show respect for its red line points and issues that have remained so far unresolved. Iran expects the United States to declare its political decision with regard to a few number of other issues that have remained standing in there. And Iran may not retreat from, materializing its demands with regard to these remaining issues, and it wants the United States to make the needed concessions. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to have any kind of agreement, irrespective of the Russian and the Chinese demands.
Yeah, Sana, if you can allow me, I just want to have, Dr. Adil, I just want to know. We know that in Middle East, lots of things are going on, especially if we look at, Yemen crisis, and if we look at Syrian crisis. Of course, there will be an effect of this deal, this nuclear deal, on both of the conflicts. I just wanted to know, for one reason, we know that Syria has an involvement of Russia in there as well, and to what extent the impact of this deal would be there, sir. Dr. Adil?
I think it's a kind of a win-win situation for United States and Iran. So I think the signals that are coming from Middle East are also positive. We have heard some statements from the leaders from the Middle Eastern countries also implicitly supporting that, because United States and Iran were moving on a positive trajectory. It will definitely have impact on what was going on in Syria and other parts in the Middle East, because without those understandings, I think it was difficult to reach to a certain agreement, because there are many spoilers, as we know, in the Middle East also, who doesn't want this deal to happen. But at this moment, they also realize this is the best that they can get. And we are in a way moving towards global recession. So bringing Iran on board and allowing Iran to export oil to fulfill that deficiency that the global world powers are facing because of the shortage of Russian supplied oil. I think that's a kind of an arrangement where Iran also gets benefited, and rest of the countries, the West, also gets benefited. And definitely it is based on certain understandings in Middle East also.
Yes, Sana?
Right, and I'd also like to continue what Mustafa was speaking about earlier. When we say Iran, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you said Iran will be materializing its demands if they're not being met, what exactly does that mean? Irrespective, like you said, of the issue that Russia is putting forward, there are challenges, and there always have been, and they're very important and significant challenges that still remain. And when we talk about all of that, then that of course means, especially when you're talking about Iranian sovereignty, that this is going to be something which is very important to Iran as well. Do you think that despite all of these issues, if Iran's demands are not being met, what sort of an action can we expect from the Iranian side, and what sort of a support would Iran then require, if it would, from other countries like Russia or China?
Definitely Tehran would backtrack. Definitely Tehran would retreat from the Vienna talks if the US continues wasting time or defies Tehran's call, because these remaining issues are very important issues, as important as the IAEA cases and the closure of the safeguard issues that Tehran had with the IAEA. Now that those dossiers of the IAEA seem to be now moving on a natural course after the roadmap was, signed by Tehran and the IAEA for the solution of these three remaining cases between the two sides. But there are three more issues, political issues, in different areas of sanctions and guarantees needed by Tehran and required by Tehran, that have been asked by Tehran from the Americans and the Europeans, and they have not yet provided Tehran with their responses. In one case, probably they have provided a response which has not been satisfactory. And if they fail to satisfy Tehran, definitely Tehran would not agree to endorse any kind of agreement, because these are very important issues that have been postponed since the very beginning, actually, or after a few weeks into the talks. Tehran has been insisting on, resolving these open brackets, and these are some of issues that were mentioned in those open brackets. There were points of differences between Tehran and the United States, and Tehran wants them to be resolved. And Tehran wants the United States to make the relevant concessions because they are very important to Tehran. Otherwise, there won't be a deal. Definitely, that's, it's not just
Right.
an issue that could be ignored.
Sana, if I could ask Professor Scott about whatever was going on
Right, and
within
let me
the
just
Gulf
be,
states.
let me just be clear. Yes,
Yeah,
Faisal.
whatever was going on within the Gulf states, of course, it's widely known that there were proxies being run by different countries. And I just wanted to know, this deal, if it goes through, of course, there would be an effect on the Gulf states, especially, Saudi Arabia, because it is facing Yemen. And if we talk about, the Gulf states like UAE, it was facing terrorism as well. And especially about Syria and Iraq. I just wanted to know that if everything goes well, America being an active ally of the Gulf states, could we say that the things would be all hunky-dory in coming future, sir?
Things are never hunky-dory in the Middle East, I'm afraid. I would say there is a possibility here, if we get the nuclear deal, that it sends a signal which links up with others. So for example, you mentioned the Yemen conflict. So there are signals from both Tehran and from Riyadh that maybe they take a step back on the sides that they're backing on the Yemen conflict to de-escalate that, which has been running for several years. There are steps coming from multiple sides that in fact Syria will be not resolved, but it will exist as three different states. Syria will in effect be partitioned even if no one recognizes it. But you have to have a caution with that. There's two cautions, in fact. The first is, even if you get a nuclear agreement, remember it doesn't solve all these issues. The 2015 nuclear agreement did not solve the issue of Iran's backing for the Assad regime, especially when the Russians and the Assad regime began expanding the killing of civilians.
Yes.
It did not solve the problem of Saudi intervening in Yemen and killing civilians. And the second problem is getting to that nuclear deal. Our Iranian friend is very interesting in what he presents, because he actually reflects a bit of a division going on within the Iranian system right now. One side's actually saying, look, we can proceed, we can get this agreement. It's Russia that's a problem here. The foreign minister, Mr. Amir Abdullahian, represented that this weekend. There are others in the Iranian system, notably the Secretary of the National Security Council, who's more like, well, no, we need to turn this back on the United States. We need to blame them. The reality is that there are probably two key issues that are here. One is the timing, the linkage between the sanctions, the relief of sanctions, and Iran's return to compliance with the agreement. And two is a guarantee against American withdrawal. Because of the nature that this is not a treaty, it's just an agreement, the Biden administration cannot give any guarantee against American withdrawal beyond the time that it's in office. And Tehran either has to take that or it has to walk away. The problem with respect to my Iranian friend is if Tehran walks away, they have less leverage than the Russians do right now because they have no economic alternative here. They have got no economic alternative to their crisis because you cannot count on Moscow, and I don't necessarily think you can count on Beijing if you don't reach this agreement.
May I talk a little bit?
Right, and my last question for Mr. Mustafa would be building on that as well, because I understand that you also have to leave, and you can add on that. I understand you also want to add something, but please also answer this. I wanted to clarify something, that when we talk about the fact that this, of course, is the issues still remain irrespective of Russia, does this mean that the Russian angle is redundant, and even so there has been no progress? So this is just an excuse to look at the Russian stance or that issue, because whatever is happening is still there largely, and when that's not resolved, the issue of the Russian side becomes small. And if that's the case, do you think that this is being used perhaps in a way that Scott was talking about from the US side as a way to be able to get a face saving from the deal, or be able to blame it on somebody else that the deal didn't work out?
First of all, let me remind you that even before the Russian stance, several Iranian officials from the foreign ministry that my colleague said, as well as many others, stressed that there are still three main issues, one minor issue remaining in there when the Russians started declaring their stance. And I would like to ask my colleague to refer to the latest remarks made by Iranian Foreign Minister Mr. Abdullahian. He said just today, as well as yesterday, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman also stressed, as well as the advisor of the Iranian team, Mr. Marandi, they have all been stressing that there are still three, at least several more, and I say three more issues beside the Russian issue. Well, they raised this before even the Russians and the Chinese started raising their demands. So there is no division in here. Let me remind my colleague that the foreign ministry is the one that goes for the negotiation. Right from several years ago, even before Mr. Rouhani started the talks, this is the National Security Council that's responsible for making decisions and drawing the frameworks, the red lines, and everything. So the one that makes the decision now, and I stress that, is the Secretary of the National Security Council in Iran, Mr. Rear Admiral Shamkhani. And he has also been very much clear about this issue as well in his tweet today. So there is no division. We have never counted on Moscow. We do not count on Chinese. They are our friends. We, of course, use their capacities with mutual respect, of course. We have counted on the decline of the United States when we say we can run our economy. Okay, friend, my friend, we are under toughest ever sanctions imposed on any nation right now. There is no sanction waiver right now, okay? But we are exporting 1.5 million barrels of oil, according to Western officials. I mean, according to Reuters, Tankers Trackers, Western media, as well as Iranian officials. They have all been stressing that we are sending out maximum export that we could have because we are producing 3 million. We use 1.2 million domestically. 3 million goes for strategic reserves to increase them, as well as 1.5 million remains in there. It's for exports. And we are bringing back the money. And after this agreement, it's impossible to bring back the money. I mean, we do spend the money abroad before, right now, and after the agreement, because U-turn, which is the toughest sanction, is a primary sanction. It still remains in place. It's not in the deal. It has never been in the JCPOA. So basically, there's not going to be much difference. And we are explaining it to the people right now, the officials as well as the media in Iran. So what we are counting on is expansion of ties with the regional states like the UAE, that's an ally of the United States, but since several months ago, they declared that they would like to repair ties with Iran, no matter what happens to the JCPOA. And when the Americans sent a delegation to protest, their official response in the media was, we don't care about the result of your Vienna talks. We have to repair the economic ties with Iran, and they've been insisting on that. The same is true with Turkey. We've been trying to expand ties with Russia, China, Latin America only in the last few months, and we count on the decline of the United States.
So,
That's
let me ask you this, Mr. Mustafa. Right, let me ask you this. Does Iran need the nuclear deal or not?
Sana, I think we have some issue with Mustafa's Skype. If we can ask the same question from Dr. Adil, if that is possible.
Yes, definitely Iran wants this deal, and Iran also realizes this is the best time it can get a favorable deal, and it won't lose this chance. So what happens unless the deal is done, we can't say, but all the signals are there that Iranians are going positively, constructively to get the best deal out of this process, and they do want to have this deal.
Dr. Adil, I just wanted to ask, while obviously Mustafa was talking about the millions of barrels of oil that is being exported by them, I just wanted to ask about, because we know that 425,000 barrels a day crude oil goes to India, and we never saw America talking about that crude oil that goes to India. Why not?
Definitely, it's all politics that we know. Lots have been happening with regard to India, and we have seen in the case of Russia also how India is being treated. Despite India's tough stance or anti-West stance in the Russian-Ukraine crisis. So that's all politics. But I don't think so. Iran is not concerned about or is not worried about its export of oil. I think the interests are both ways. United States desperately want Iranian oil at this time to stabilize some prices so that the West doesn't go into recession. And Iranians also, they also understand, and they would negotiate hard, but they would want this deal to materialize as soon as possible because it's in the interest of both the countries.
Exactly. Sana, if we have Professor Scott
right, and
with
Faisal,
us.
I also want to ask you with reference to what Scott said earlier. Yes. Let me just also go back to Scott as well, because this is something Scott earlier mentioned, and he talked about how just as we were saying whether or not Iran actually does have a backup plan or not, that where will it go and what will be that option, and Mr. Mustafa was presenting a different picture, but I want to understand what really is the case. How do we look at it, and what sort of options would Iran actually have? Would it be more suffering? Will it be more harm? Or is it not actually that damaging for Iran to not go ahead with this deal as well? And then when we talk about how Iranian sovereignty is, of course, very important, as it is to other countries, but as Mr. Mustafa was highlighting, this is, of course, an important aspect of Iranian foreign policy as well. Will it just go to any length in terms of the economic cost that it's going to bear, but not compromise on the so-called stance in which their integrity or sovereignty is harmed?
Well, that's the key question here, because as your studio guest or analyst are pointing out, it's logically, you say it's in Iran's interest to get this deal, to begin to sell oil again at record prices. One fact, just to our Iranian friend, Mr. Mustafa, Iran is selling less than 50% of the oil that it sold in 2018, even that 1.5 million barrels of oil. And a lot of that is on the so-called gray market. In other words, it's not strictly legal. Now, Iran, if it does not continue this deal, will continue to have that restricted sale of oil. And India, which has not taken Iranian oil since 2018, at least officially, because of the US sanctions, will continue not to do so. Turkey will continue not to do so. So you can see the logic about accepting the deal, compromising with not only the United States, but with the Europeans. Don't forget them. But on the other hand, and this is where the divide is within Iran, and I understand why Mr. Mustafa covered this up, there are those who want to, they're putting more priority on Iranian face, on Iranian presentation. And that's why he mentioned this National Security Council. If they have the ultimate decision, they're the ones that are taking the harder line than the foreign ministry right now and saying, no, the US guarantees aren't sufficient. No, we don't want this type of link between sanctions in our compliance with the deal. Because remember, the ultimate person who makes this decision is not the foreign ministry. It's not the National Security Council. It's the supreme leader. So does he choose, because he has this longstanding hostility to the United States, to give up on the deal and to give up on Iran's economic future? Or does he modify his language and say, yes, compromise deal is the way forward for the sake of our economy and for the sake of our international standing?
Professor Scott, looking at the current situation, which is in East Europe,
Scott,
right
my
now.
last question to you before you go. When we speak about Russia as well. When we speak about the fact that there is, of course, a concern from the Russian side as well in terms of the sanctions, could this be, the stance that Russia is putting forward also be another way to sort of tilt the balance towards itself as well when it talks about sanctions in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis that have been put on it? Can this be a way to make the US also perhaps budge from that?
I think the Russians miscalculated. I think they miscalculated with this threat against the Iran nuclear deal because they thought Tehran would back them up. And Tehran didn't back them up. And then they realized that the US and Europe are united on their position. Just as I might add, this has been a miscalculation by Vladimir Putin from the invasion forward. His whole gamble was that the US, Europe, the international community would sacrifice Ukraine. Guess what? They haven't.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott. It's always a pleasure having you
because
in our program.
the whole question here that I fail to understand, of course, is that why exactly did Russia even go ahead with such a stance? Thank you very much, Scott Lucas, for joining us in the debate. Faisal, you were adding something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question from Dr. Adil, and it's a very interesting question. Right now, if we look at the Eastern European situation, of course, there is war going on, and if we look at Europe as a whole, 38% of their energy, it was already coming from the Russian side. Can we say that West itself wants a good relation and wants to lift the sanctions from Iran because they can see, they can sense that in coming days they will be facing energy crisis, and to meet them energy crisis, they want to build up relations with Iran so that they can get all of the oils, crude oil, and they can meet their challenges, the energy challenges?
Iran cannot be replacement for what Russia was providing to Europe, and even in the long term, because Iran would take certain time, so a few months, to reach to that level, to pre-sanctions era, where it can provide that kind of oil to the global market. But as we have seen the infrastructure between Europe and Russia, I don't think so Iranians could be a replacement to the Russian energy sources. But definitely it will dampen the impact of these sanctions or the oil embargoes from Russia. It might help dampen, but I don't think so it would be a replacement to the Russian sources, energy sources.
Yes, Sana.
All right, and speaking about energy, Faisal, of course, our next segment also looks at this, and this is an important aspect that is affecting economies all over the world. And we really need to look at how exactly countries and economies like Pakistan moving forward are going to tackle that. We've also been joined by Dr. Gulfaraz Ahmed, who's a former Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. Welcome to the debate, Dr. Gulfaraz, and thank you for joining us in the debate. When we speak about the overall crisis, of course, since COVID-19 has struck, we understand that there has been a global problem that the countries around the world have been facing. But then again, we also see that it's impacting different economies differently. Of course, countries developing like Pakistan have been impacted perhaps more severely than others. And now we also know that there is a shortage of diesel, and perhaps the situation seems to be getting worse. How exactly do you think it's going to go in terms of the trends that it's going to follow in the coming months and years? And then how will countries like Pakistan be able to tackle with it?
Hello?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, Dr. Gulfaraz, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you, Dr. Gulfaraz.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Are you starting it?
Dr. Gulfaraz, we can hear you,
Yes,
sir.
Dr. Gulfaraz, you're actually online with us on the debate. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. What is it that you are discussing?
Dr. Gulfaraz, when we're talking about the overall, we're discussing the overall economic crisis and price hike, of course, that we see around the world since COVID-19 has struck. And we now know also that there's so many issues with regards to fuel, transportation costs, the shortage of diesel, petroleum and oil. And all of this, of course, impacts economies like Pakistan more severely than others, perhaps. What do you think will be the future trend of these prices, and how do countries like Pakistan actually tackle them?
Yes, as you mentioned yourself, first of all, the world was hit by coronavirus, and last 2.5 years, the world economies all shrank, and people went through serious economic challenges, countries at the national level and individuals at the personal level. And now that the world was beginning to come out of corona, and the economies were trying to find their way to, make an effort towards catching up where they last left, that we have had this development, Russia-Ukraine. Here I want to add something that the world has been facing challenges of energy, because the energy production sources had gone down. During Corona, there was a time when they were selling with negative price, but then the world economies have turned around rather quickly, and the energy shortage is being experienced, particularly the natural gas market, and in that the fastest growing natural gas market is LNG. And LNG is a great source of energy for Pakistan also. And at this point in time, it is a seller's market, because the energy capacity in the world is less than the energy demand, and therefore its price has been going up and up. So while the energy price, the natural gas price was going up, then also the oil demand increased, and the suppliers weren't able to meet it so easily, and the oil price started rising from prevailing 40s about 6 to 8 weeks back. It went up to $90, and then as Ukraine and Russia problem arose, today it is at $135. But the outlook is very scary if this fighting continues for some more time, and no one can replace Russian contribution to oil and natural gas in the world, particularly to Europe. I heard that.
And Dr. Gulfraz, I was just coming to that. Because for Pakistan, as you mentioned, gas, of course, is very important. LNG is very important. A lot of our gas pipeline projects, for one reason or the other, have been stalled. And such mega projects are important for us in terms of prices and access and availability of these resources as well. And Russia is an important factor in that. Moving forward, do you think that this is going to significantly impact Pakistan's economy? And do you see potentially these issues being resolved in terms of our energy and connectivity projects with Russia and other countries?
You know, in the short time, days and weeks ahead, Pakistan's economy can be extremely burdened by the increasing price of oil. You know, the government had given a very big relief to the people, reducing the price of petrol and diesel by 10 rupees and of electricity by 5 rupees. And what is more, the government ended up making a commitment that they would not increase the prices till, of course, the new budget. That means about 4 months ahead. But the new developments which have taken place, it is impossible for Pakistan's economy to absorb the increase which has already taken place from $90. Today it is $135. Pakistan's government cannot sustain that, and therefore Pakistan government would have to use all the instruments they have to ameliorate the burden on the people, but they would still have to increase. But if the Russian oil goes off the market, if the Russian
all right. Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, Dr. Gulfraz Ahmed. Thank you very much for being a part of the debate. Faisal, I'll come back to you in the studio. When we talk about the looming crisis, of course, and we understand that this is important, Pakistan's efforts perhaps are not being looked at as vigorously, or as are not being appreciated enough, perhaps because maybe we don't really understand what's really going on a larger scale. And this, of course, is important for our viewers to also understand and take a look at what really is going on in terms of the global economy and how much of an effort is being put to curtail the impact of that within Pakistan. Thank you very much, Raja, Faisal and Adil Sultan, for being with us in the studio, and for all our guests who've joined us in the debate online as well. That's it for now. We'll join you once again tomorrow at 7 p.m. only on PTV World.